welcome everybody here at the Harvard Faculty Club this afternoon in Cambridge, Massachusetts for another in what is a series of online international conferences that the Boston Global Forum is conducting over the past 3 years. The Boston Global Forum was created to see if we could take advantage of a lot of the learning and experience and wisdom of people here in the Boston area and focus every year on an important international issue. We began on the subject of occupational safety and health standards after the disasters in Bangladesh. And I'd like to think that we contributed to the dialogue, which has significantly improved that situation. And then we turned to the very difficult and very important question of how to create a framework for peace and security in the Pacific. And that has been our subject for the past several months. And today, we're going to try to conclude that discussion, although obviously our interest in this will be ongoing, because the situation in the Pacific continues to be difficult. I don't think we've quite achieved the kind of international consensus that we hoped we could achieve. So this is going to be a continuing effort. But today we're going to try to see if we can sum up our discussion over the course of the past several months and see if we can at least establish a plan, set of principles that might govern relationships in that part of the world. And then we're going to go on to our topic for the coming year, which will be the whole issue of cyber warfare and what we do about it, before we end up with another Cold War, only this time on another aspect of international conflict. For whatever reason, the world seems to be able to produce lots and lots of issues that we can deal with, and there never seemed to be a lack of them. But it's been wonderfully rewarding, I must say, for myself, and I think for my colleagues who were deeply involved in this, and especially for Glenn Wendt, who was the creator of this, to get the kind of response we've got and the interest in seeing if we can't do some problem solving. And so this afternoon, for the next couple of hours, we're going to see if we can wrap up our discussion on the question of the framework for peace and security in the Pacific with the help of some very, very good people, and at least set the stage for what we hope will be some serious action on the international front in a collaborative way to deal with this problem and minimize the conflict and maximize the kind of collaboration that we want to have. So with that, we're going to begin with David Sanger, the chief Washington correspondent of the New York Times, who spends a little bit of his time up here in Cambridge at the Belfer Center, and ask him to kick things off, and then we're going to have ourselves a good lively discussion for the next couple of hours. David?
Thank you very much, Governor. It's great to be back here at the Global Forum. It's a terrific series, and always enjoyed our discussions here. I thought that maybe the thing I could do that would be most useful at the beginning here, since I come to this more as a reporter than a true academic studying these issues in the South China Sea, though we try to take them up in a Harvard course that Grant Allison and I teach, is to talk a little bit about the events that led up to the summit meeting between President Obama and President Xi just 2.5 weeks ago, and how this issue played there, where it factored into the meeting, and where we think it's headed. So, as President Xi was preparing for this meeting and President Obama was trying to set the agenda for it, it was clear that there were some areas where they would be able to announce some significant progress. Climate change was the one that was the easiest because it required the Chinese merely to re-announce the things that they were already planning to go do anyway. That the hardest issue was going to be cyber. The next topic that is Governor Takaka said will be taking up here, and that the one in which they were likely to make the least progress was the South China Sea issue. And that's essentially how it worked out. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But the subtext of the entire discussion between President Obama and President Xi was to try to figure out whether or not Mr. Xi himself would be in a position to actually make many compromises, whether they could get a better read on the question of why they had misunderstood when President Xi first came to power 2 years ago, how aggressive he would be on these territorial issues. Remember, when President Xi took over, he had come to the United States just a few months before, taken a tour with Vice President Biden, went back to the house in Iowa where he had visited as a young party official, said all the right things. And many in the Obama White House thought that he was going to pursue the line that Hu Jintao's state counselor, Dai Binghua, had written about at the end of President Hu's time, which was basically an essay that said, don't challenge the United States right now or any other major power. Focus on the domestic economy, consolidate your power, but follow what Deng Xiaoping would tell us to do, which was basically bide our time. The moment will come to deal with all these issues. And most of the intelligence reports that were floating around to the White House, the State Department, the Defense Department, strongly seemed to suggest that the United States thought Xi would do exactly that. And they had it wrong. They got right the Xi Jinping that wanted to go deal with corruption, with consolidating his power. They got wrong the risk-taker side of Xi. And so what did we see happen? We saw a huge rise in the cyber attacks, which were going on anyway at this time. And then we also saw a significant rise in the activity in the South China Sea, including the building of the islands, the pictures therefore. They're not really islands, I guess I would say, building military facilities on half-submerged reefs. The president decided to try to deal with cyber first, and that didn't go anywhere at his first meetings with President Xi, which were at Sunnylands. And in the area of the territorial challenges, the first thing that the president had to go face was the declaration of the air defense identification zone that the Chinese had declared over a very broad area. And the U.S. response to that was to immediately send some B-52s right through the middle of the zone in order to make the point that the U.S. didn't recognize this. But with the islands, they've been much more cautious. There have been a number of naval activities around this new construction, but nothing that went inside the 12-mile limit that the Chinese declared, because the Chinese, of course, are playing the game of saying that this is truly their territory, and therefore they've got 12 miles around it. The Navy and the new head of PACOM, Admiral Harry Harris, pressed very hard internally to send one of those missions within 12 miles prior to the Xi visit. And this was rejected by the White House for fear that it would poison the atmosphere of the visit and force the Chinese to take some kind of harder line than they thought was necessary. All of the indications we have now is that that mission to go inside the 12-mile area or within 12 miles of these reefs is likely to happen in the next few weeks, now that the visit is over. That Admiral Harris won his point, he just didn't win his timing. Now, the bigger question is the one that Bob Gates used to put so wonderfully whenever some kind of major project was proposed to the military, where he used to say that the three words least asked in Washington are, and then what? And the interesting question for the Navy right now, as we get ready to go inside these limits, is the "and then what" question. Because it's not at all clear to us at this point how the Chinese are going to respond. The betting is that the Chinese will harass and follow these ships, but won't do anything that is overtly hostile. But it is a big game of chicken, because the Chinese have looked at President Obama and calculated, quite rightly, that we're not going to risk a military conflict for a group of reefs that until 2 years ago were largely of interest for fishing purposes. And they've got that right. If you look across the range of the activities that President Obama has engaged in or not, he has very much followed the light footprint strategy. That is to say, he's willing to use cyber assets, he's willing to go use drones, he's willing to arm rebels occasionally and train allies, whether they are the Iraqis or others, but he's not willing to go be in a position that's going to risk a significant conflict. In this particular case, I think they're calculating that Xi isn't willing to risk it either. I mean, Xi has got other problems right now. And what made this summit particularly fascinating, it was the first one in years, you might argue 2 decades, in which a Chinese leader showed up in Washington in a position of weakness rather than one of strength, largely out of the economic downturn, which has led us to question whether or not the length and degree of support that Xi Jinping has is as great as we initially were saying, or even were saying 6 months ago when people were making the case that he's the strongest Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping. So that's the situation that we are headed into now. I think the President wants very much to make the point that we do not recognize this territory as Chinese territory. At the press conference with President Xi, he went out of his way to say the United States will fully respect international law on these issues and expects the Chinese to as well. And that was interpreted by the Chinese as a sign that he would, in fact, start the mission up that they're going to head into. I think the bigger question is, can you keep this issue from becoming a very big one in the relationship? And can you persuade the Chinese that most of what they're doing right now is taking the other regional players and driving them right into the American camp? And the American argument is that's just what happens. This is happening now. The Filipinos are talking about reopening a version of Clark Air Base. To do that, they're going to have to throw FedEx out of Clark Air Base. Good luck with that. The Vietnamese have been suddenly very interested in talks with the United States. And here we had the remarkable sight just a few months ago of a leader of the Vietnamese Communist Party sitting in the Oval Office having a nice chat and a cup of coffee with the President of the United States. For anybody in the room old enough to remember Vietnam, that is a pretty mind-bending concept. So I think over the next year or two, the United States sees a moment, not necessarily of the upper hand, but certainly of some leverage here. And that's something probably worth our exploring. I think I've probably gone longer than I promised the governor I would, so I will leave it at that, but I hope this gives you a little bit of a snapshot of where we are today. Thank you, Dave. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Governor. Thank you very much to Ong Tuan for the invitation. I'm on a possibly ropey internet connection, so let's hope the force is with us. I will attempt to just launch a PowerPoint presentation. I thought it might be played from there, but if you want me to play it from here, then I'll do it from here. 1 second. So, yeah, can you see that? Right. If I put that on my
let me show the PowerPoint for you on here. Okay, you just speak and then
I think it'll be a bit easier. Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Okay. So People have spoken about what China has been doing in the South China Sea recently in the last 2 years as a fait accompli. So my question is, what has China accomplished in the last 2 years? And I think the significance of China's island building lies less in what it has done so far than what it might be about to do. I think it's worth remembering that even though China has been dredging and building since September 2013, it hasn't occupied any new territory. 6 of the 7 recently built islands lie on reefs that China settled in 1988, and the 7th, Mischief Reef, was occupied in 1994. So the question is, what will China do next? Do we have the slides up? I just check. Hello?
Yes,
Do we
the
have
slide up, the slide up.
Yeah, do you
Yeah,
have the
it's
one
the
that
slide.
says current concerns?
Which phase are you at now?
Current concerns.
Current concern. Okay, yes.
Yes. So in my view, concern should focus on 3 areas of sea: the Vanguard Bank off the Vietnamese coast, the Reed Bank or Recto Bank off the Philippines coast, and around the Luconia Shoals and the James Shoal off the Malaysian coast. All 3 have significant oil and gas potential. That's not to say that hydrocarbons are the sole reason for China's island building. There are many motivations reflecting China's many security interests and its many internal lobbies. Next slide, please. Back in April, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson provided a list of these motivations. It was a long list, perhaps to camouflage the most important items: territorial defense, including the assertion of sovereignty for its own sake, and maritime rights, the harvesting of mineral resources and fish around the islands. In contrast to those such as, for example, the Australian analyst Hugh White, who argue that the South China Sea confrontation is all about a clever plan to ensnare the US into very difficult commitments with its allies and partners and then to break those commitments, I concluded that in the Chinese worldview, and I disagree with this, but in the Chinese worldview, the island building is a defensive move. However, I would argue that that worldview is founded upon a strong, though very misplaced, sense of historical entitlement. China may not yet be a great power, but it's already acquiring great power autism. Next slide, please. So ever since Deng Xiaoping ordered the creation of China's first special economic zone in Shenzhen in 1980, national prosperity has depended upon an arc of cities around the country's coast. The Communist Party leadership fears intervention against these cities and ports by the United States, either as a direct move against its rule or perhaps within the context of a Taiwan crisis. The new islands, equipped with over-the-horizon radar, hypersonic anti-ship missiles and anti-submarine capabilities, would presumably form part of some kind of Chinese sea denial strategy to try and protect its coast. Next slide, please. Another reason is that China's been a net importer of food since 2007, and in turn 2 years ago it overtook the US as the world's largest oil importer. Foreign trade makes up 40% of GDP in China compared to less than a third in the US. Yet the country has no clear access to the open sea. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't appear to believe that free trade and the global commons are sufficient to deliver security. And I would suggest that the more that American officials or foreign affairs experts talk about offshore balancing, which is code really for starving China into submission in the event of a conflict, the more the Chinese military will make plans to try and make that more difficult. By creating runways, bases, and logistics depots on the reefs, China is creating the capacity to project power closer to the Straits of Malacca to protect those trade routes. The Chinese Defense White Paper, published in May, handed the PLA a new strategic task to safeguard the security of China's overseas interests, especially in the maritime domain. According to the White Paper, the PLA Navy will gradually shift its focus from offshore waters defence to a combination of offshore waters defence with, quotes, open seas protection. Next slide, please. Another military reason may be the desire to construct in the South China Sea what submariners call a bastion, an area of relatively deep water in which ballistic missile submarines can hide. The Soviet Union turned the Sea of Okhotsk, northeast of Japan, into such a bastion during the Cold War. China's development of a large submarine base at Yulin on the southern tip of Hainan Island, combined with the recent constructions in the Spratly, suggest Beijing may have borrowed this idea. Next slide, please. On a regional level, China's island building is presumably intended to deter Southeast Asian claimants from exploiting the resources around the Spratlys. Shorter supply lines and reliable bases will enable more Coast Guard and naval vessels and aircraft to be on station. The extra radar and local deployment of patrol aircraft will facilitate greater maritime domain awareness. Next slide, please. Access to fisheries is important. As incomes rose in China between 1970 and 2010, the proportion of fish in the national diet quintupled to 25 kilos a year. As it gets richer, this number will presumably rise. Overfishing has forced crews to look further out to sea. In 1988, 90% of the Chinese fishing industry worked inshore, just close to the coast. By 2006, 60% of the catch in Guangzhou province was offshore. Trawlers received tens of thousands of dollars in grants to expand their capacity to fish further away from home. And hundreds, possibly even thousands of fishing boats from Hainan province received between $300 and $500 a day to go fishing in disputed waters. The next slide, please. And then there's oil and gas. Vietnam claims the Vanguard Bank and leased the hydrocarbon rights to Talisman, formerly of Canada, now part of Repsol. But in July 2014, the Chinese rights to sail into the same part of the sea was sold to Bright Oil, a Hong Kong-based company with strong connections to the Chinese political establishment. It's possible that this could be a prelude to renewed efforts by China to drill there once the supporting military and Coast Guard infrastructure is in place in the Spratlys. Next slide, please. Malaysia already has active oil production operations around the Luconia Shoals within its claimed exclusive economic zone off the coast of Borneo. However, in June this year, the Malaysian government revealed that a Chinese Coast Guard vessel had been anchored near the shoals for 2 years. China is also thought to regard the James Shoal area even closer to the Malaysian coast as also oil-rich. Next one. A tragicomic translation error in the 1930s resulted in Chinese schoolchildren being taught to this day that the James Shoal is the country's southernmost territory. In fact, there is no territory at the shoal. It's an underwater feature. Next slide. Currently, about a third of the electricity used on the main Philippine island of Luzon is generated by gas from the Malampaya field off Palawan. Philippine media reports suggest that Malampaya will run out within 10 years. However, there appears to be plenty of gas under the Reed Bank, which, although inside the Philippines' claimed exclusive economic zone, is also well within the U-shaped line claimed by China. In March 2015, Forum Energy, London-listed but Philippine-controlled, revealed it had been denied permission by the Philippine government to drill on Reed Bank because of objections from China, and the company was forced to delist its shares from the London Stock Exchange. We can be reasonably sure that China will attempt to obstruct any attempt by the Philippines to drill in this area. Mischief Reef, with its new runway, is just 60 nautical miles away. It's easy to term these resource grabs as offensive moves, but from a Chinese perspective, I would argue that it's the Southeast Asian countries that are trespassing on Chinese historic territory. This is a Chinese argument, not mine. Asserting sea control in the Spratlys is, I would argue, in Beijing's view, all about defending national sovereignty and protecting maritime rights. Next slide, please. Now, I would argue that this view of history is nonsense. No government administered the islands until the 20th century. Chinese interest began in 1909, when in response to a Japanese merchant extracting guano from Pratas Island, the governor of Guangzhou province launched an expedition to the Paracels. China expressed no interest in the Spratlys until 1935, and no Chinese official ever visited the Spratlys before the 12th of December 1946. Next slide, please. Nonetheless, in the first half of the 20th century, an emerging nationalist consciousness resulting from the sense of national humiliation inflicted by foreign powers created a strong belief in the South China, that the South China Sea was historically Chinese. Can we move on to the next one? National humiliation, please. Its origins lie, this sense that the South China Sea is Chinese, its origins lie in an intellectual car crash, combining misunderstandings about history, namely that the Southeast Asian territories that once sent tribute to the Chinese emperor considered themselves to be part of a Chinese domain, with the introduction of Westphalian-type borders into Asia. It's noticeable that whereas China has settled all its land borders with almost all of its neighbours, India being the exception, it's in dispute on all three of its maritime frontiers. I can go into more on that if you want. Next slide, please. It's vital to grasp the significance of this sense of historical entitlement because it underpins everything that China is doing. I say there's a symbiotic relationship between nationalist voices using resource arguments to justify their historic claim and state agencies using nationalist arguments to justify the resource grab. Next slide, please. China, both the ROC and the PRC, advanced a claim and then a physical presence over the Spratly Islands as their knowledge and capabilities grew in the 20th century. It's been a slow and fitful advance, but it has been consistent. I don't believe it will end until China occupies every land feature in the sea and controls the sea spaces in between. When China talks about negotiating with rival claimants, it's hard to believe it means anything other than ultimately persuading those rivals to abandon their position. Although people remember Deng's shelve disputes pursue joint development dictum, they always forget that the first part of that dictum was sovereignty is ours. Next slide, please. It's not over yet, is the slide. It's not over yet. I think it's game on. China remains a minority shareholder in the Spratlys. Vietnam occupies more than half the features, and so far, China hasn't used force to evict any of the other claimants from their possessions in the Spratlys. People will say, what about Johnson Reef? But Johnson Reef in 1988, forces from China and Vietnam landed simultaneously, more or less, on the same feature and had a fist fight, which eventually turned into a gun battle, killing 64 Vietnamese. I would say the same is true on Scarborough Shoal. The Chinese haven't evicted any Philippine forces from the feature, closed off access. Just closed off access. It's a technical point, perhaps, but I think that it is significant. We need to unpack the Chinese term active defense here. In the South China Sea, it has come to mean waiting for a pretext to take offensive action. As I heard Major General Chen Zhou explain last year, win by striking only after the enemy has struck. Final slide, please, the one that says UNCLOS solution. But by sticking to its U-shaped line claim, despite the case being brought by the Philippines at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, China is heading for direct conflict with the current norms of international law. It's not hard to see why it rejects a solution based upon UNCLOS. It would lose any hope of access to wide areas of sea. China would prefer an imaginative interpretation of customary international law that would recognize an historic claim to all the waters inside the U-shaped line. It seems Beijing no longer regards UNCLOS as a neutral arbiter of disputes, but rather as a partisan weapon being wielded to sever China from its historic rights. Some Western analysts have told me they believe the U-shaped line is just an opening gambit from which Beijing will negotiate a compromise. I think they're wrong. It is the destination towards which China is inexorably heading. That's the end of my paper.
Well, thank you very much. We're really pleased to have the Consul General, Japanese Consul General, here in Boston with us. He's having a dinner at his house tonight. Swan and I and Kitty are going to be there, so we're going to let him go a little earlier so we can prepare for all of this. So, Consul General, come and join us.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, everybody. Well, I did not prepare anything as an expert and elaborate as the two previous presenters have done. Only reason I'm speaking here is because I'm host for the dinner, and unless I go there, there is no food. But I can assure I'm not cooking, so food will be delicious. But seriously, this issue, South China Sea, in itself is an example of magnitude. But also, this is an example of many other issues. Particularly from our perspectives, the relevance or the challenge to the international law is crucial. If we let something happen by default, if somebody can do a fait accompli without challenges of international law and international community, this is setting a very dangerous precedent, where we already have other very serious examples in other parts of the world. So we, including our Prime Minister and our government, are very much in support of all of us working together, impress upon the importance of treating this issue, UNCLOS and other international law bases. This is, some people say, is a weak argument because we cannot force one party to go along that way, but we hope we will mount more of collaboration so that we will be effective on that. And for that to happen, we need to see collaborators within China. We hope that the people in China could realize there are better way of dealing with their desires, including favorable international environment, resources issues. So not only to be fair on us on the issues which is in contradiction of international law, but we will be, for Japan included, we are reaching out everybody who is willing to, for the dialogue, find a solution. Finally, it is critical, without mentioning it, that where U.S. stands on this issue. For Japan, we are particularly blessed by the very clear, strong commitment from the United States in regard to East China Sea. And the American president, the President Obama's clear commitment really changed the environment. So I can safely say where the U.S. stands on South China Sea remains and will be very, very paramountly important. Thank you for giving me this chance to share our thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Himeno, very much. We look forward to seeing you later on this evening. We're now going to turn to Bonnie Glaser, who has participated in some of our sessions. And I think many of you know her and know of her work. She's the Senior Advisor for Asia and the Director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I think we're ready to listen to her now. Welcome.
Good evening, Governor. Thank you so much for having me. I regret that I'm not able to be there with you in person, but I appreciate the opportunity to join the conversation. I wonder if my slides are set up?
Yes.
Okay.
Give me a second.
So I don't have very many slides, but I think when we talk about what's going on in the South China Sea, it's really always useful to have some visuals. As many of you know, we've been running a project here at CSIS called the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, and we've been partnering with Digital Globe to obtain satellite imagery and try and track some of the dredging and construction that has been taking place in the Spratly Islands. So I don't know if my slides are up, but the first, yep.
There's some issue with the slide. Can you? Is it okay if we just speak without them? I'll show them and give it to the participant later.
Okay, so we'll skip the slides. Okay, so what you can imagine is 5 slides that are fading, showing you what it looked like as a very pristine, small land feature at Fiery Cross, and then gradually over a 1.5-year period evolving to what we have today on Fiery Cross, which of course is 3,000 acres altogether in the Spratlys, but this particular island has the most buildup we've seen anywhere. Lots of things like cement factories, potentially what looked like radars. When I was on a panel with Admiral Harry Harris at the Aspen Security Forum in July, he said that he has seen hangars there for tactical aircraft. They have better resolution than we get. We haven't been able to see that yet. There is a very long runway. We now see that there are runways that are being built on Subi and Mischief Reefs as well. So there's
yes? So you can refer to them now. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. So what you can do is just go through the first series of, if you go to the next, I guess, yeah, and if you click on that slide several times, it should, if it's working properly. I'm not very technically inclined, but you can see that it will roll through and show. I'm getting feedback on my ear, guys.
Yes,
it's
went
through. To eliminate that?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm hearing myself talk.
You can see your slide too.
Okay, but I can see the slides, but I'm also hearing myself talk, and that's it's a little bit disconcerting. I don't know if you can get rid of that. Maybe not. Okay. Okay, I think it stopped. So let me just go on and say, of course, the United States has proposed that there is a halt to land reclamation, construction, and militarization. And the Chinese have repeatedly said what they are doing is legal, justifiable, and reasonable. David Sanger talked a little bit about Xi Jinping's visit, his conversations with President Obama. I understand there was no progress made on this issue. Xi Jinping at the press conference did say that China is committed to maintaining peace and stability in the South China Sea, managing differences and disputes through dialogue, upholding freedom of navigation and overflight, and exploring ways to achieve mutual benefit through cooperation. And then he quite surprisingly, I think to everybody, said China does not intend to pursue militarization. This was not said privately in the discussions with the president, as I understand it, either in the Oval Office or at Blair House. But Xi Jinping provided no definition for the term militarization, and I suspect that the United States and China really do have different understandings. But I do think that Xi Jinping's statement provides a possible opening to explore ways to lower tensions through possible limits on the use of land features by all the claimants. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. A few other just recent developments that I think are worth highlighting. Often below the radar screen, there are constant episodes of bullying and intimidation by China in various waters in the South China Sea. And indeed, just 2 weeks ago, a Chinese vessel rammed and sank a Vietnamese fishing boat. And the reports that I've read in the Vietnamese press claim that the Chinese crew were using knives, threatening 6 Vietnamese fishermen, and seized a very large 2-ton catch of fish. So these kinds of things are going on all the time as well. So if we go on to the next slide, which says, why should we care? For those of you who pay attention to this issue, of course, this is not new information. 8 of the world's 10 busiest container ports are in the Asia-Pacific region, and 5.3 trillion of trade, which is 30% of the world's maritime trade, goes through the South China Sea annually. And then if you scroll to the next slide, I think there's a slide on the major trade routes, just to show you how important the South China Sea is in the very major trade routes that come from Africa through the Strait of Malacca and Lombok, and all the way through up to Japan, Korea, and of course to China. And then there's a slide on the LNG flows and some of the pathways that they take, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So ambiguity remains essentially, I believe, a major source of instability in the South China Sea. And I think a big question that I have and many people still have is, what is China's desired end state in the South China Sea? And we really don't know the answer to this. Does Beijing seek to just strengthen its bargaining position for an eventual negotiated outcome in which China accepts the presence of all the claimants on the land features they now occupy, and accepts all the provisions of UNCLOS, maybe drops any historic rights claim over waters in the South China Sea, accepts rules within a code of conduct, and agrees to share the South China Sea and its resources. That's one possible scenario. As Bill Hayton was talking about, China's perspective on this is very different. They see themselves as catching up after lagging behind Vietnam and Malaysia and even Taiwan and the Philippines in the Spratlys. And so they clearly want to improve their situation and change the status quo in their favor. And maybe at some point they might want to strike a deal. Of course, another scenario is that the Chinese ultimately really seek complete control over the sea and the airspace in the South China Sea, and maybe have the ambition to eventually control all the land features as well. And I don't rule this out either. I think we don't know, and China remains deliberately ambiguous about both its claims and its objectives. So right after Xi Jinping was in Washington, there was a group of PLA scholars and from various institutions in the PLA in Washington, D.C. And there were some interesting things that were voiced in this meeting that I participated in. Some of them suggested, and I've heard this from in fact, Chinese lawyers as well, that China plans to draw straight archipelagic baselines in the Spratlys, which is what they've done in the Paracels. This is a violation of UNCLOS. But this, I think, would be quite worrisome and really destabilizing if they move in this direction. And other PLA officers suggested that to defend Chinese interest in these waters, it's not enough to simply have, let's say, gun emplacements or short-range artillery to protect specific land features, but that China must have a force projection capability in the South China Sea. So this goes back to this question of what did Xi Jinping mean by what he said, Wu Yi Jun Shi Hua. For those of you who speak Chinese, we have no intention to militarize. So although China's objectives are not known, its actions, I think, for the past several years have been quite worrisome. There has been, as I said, periodic bullying and intimidation tactics to pressure smaller neighbors to accommodate to Chinese interests. And these steps, I think, are incrementally aimed at changing the status quo. Many people refer to this as, salami slicing, while carefully not provoking any real pushback from the United States. And the seizure of Scarborough Shoal, I think, in 2012, and China's land reclamation provide just two examples. I think it's impossible to roll back China's gains, and I think demilitarization of the South China Sea is not achievable. But the question is, what is achievable? And so I'd like to maybe be a little bit more constructive in that regard. I think there may be potential to cap militarization. So the claimants could agree, for example, on weapon systems and capabilities that would not be deployed on land features in the South China Sea. So, for example, surface-to-air missiles, anti-ship missiles, which I think would be particularly destabilizing. There might be an attempt to define what could be defensive versus offensive capabilities and try to forego acquisition of offensive capabilities if a definition could be agreed upon. And so in that regard, I think that Xi Jinping raising this idea of non-militarization of these features at least is an opportunity. Up until now, I think there really has been just no way forward potentially at all, other than trying to encourage everybody to sign a code of conduct. So I think that the U.S., along with Vietnam and other countries, should take the initiative to promote a common understanding of what might be defined as no militarization, and to try to influence China's approach to implementing this commitment made by Xi Jinping. So then I wanted to pick up on what David Sanger talked about with the pending freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs, by the U.S., and it has been reported that the U.S. is on the verge of conducting what should have been done quietly with no fanfare a long time ago, a mere incursion into 12 nautical miles around a previously submerged feature or low tide elevation that is now a bigger artificial island. So Subi Reef and Mischief Reefs, I think, are the likely candidates here. This doesn't signal a change in U.S. neutral position on the sovereignty issue. The U.S. is simply asserting its territorial rights of transit under international legal norms. And as I'm sure most of you know, the U.S. has a long-standing FONOP program that challenges excessive maritime claims by sailing and flying through international waters and airspace. The list of countries that the U.S. conducts FONOPs against last year, for example, in 2014, included some of our allies, the Philippines and South Korea, as well as our security partners, Taiwan and Vietnam. So this is not something that is intended to be an aggressive action. Unfortunately, it has been misreported by media everywhere as challenging China's sovereignty. And now the Chinese, of course, have distorted it as well as being a very provocative action. So China, of course, has repeatedly warned U.S. ships and aircrafts first to stay out of an undefined military alert zone around its artificial islands. And according to UNCLOS, formerly submerged reefs can only have a maximum of a 500-meter safety zone. So nobody knows what the Chinese mean by this military alert zone. So these FONOPs, if they actually take place, which I assume they will be the first time that the U.S. is conducting such an operation inside the 12 nautical miles of an artificial island that was previously a submerged feature. But the U.S. has been conducting FONOPs in the Paracels and Spratlys in recent years. So it's not as if the U.S. has not been conducting operations there. So these, in my view, will signal China that the U.S. has the resolve to enforce international law. Conducting such patrols are only one tool in the U.S. toolbox, however, and they have to be part of a larger strategy to persuade China to refrain from destabilizing actions and to rely instead on diplomacy to manage and address its territorial disputes with its neighbors. So far, I think Beijing sees the costs of continuing its destabilizing behavior as very low compared to the benefits that it is getting. So changing China's calculus really requires a more effective strategy. In my view, the U.S. cannot do this alone. The other claimants, along with neighbors who have interests in the South China Sea, should work together to shape Chinese decision-making. So, for example, willing members of ASEAN should draft a code of conduct and work to convince other members to sign it. And even if unsuccessful, the process would put pressure on China to engage more seriously in COC negotiations. I think the Philippines needs to move to implement the EDCO, or Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, so that U.S. troops can have access to local military bases. I think that's an important part of this strategy as well. And I personally would like to see Australia and Japan conducting FONOPs in the South China Sea as well, although not necessarily jointly with the United States, but unilaterally. If the arbitral tribunal that is considering the Philippines case finds jurisdiction on at least one of the arguments put forward by Manila, then I think like-minded countries really need to step up efforts to create some positive outcomes, including consequences if China ignores an eventual ruling against it. Now, the South China Sea, of course, is not inherently a U.S.-China issue, which is one of the reasons why other countries really need to step up here. But it does involve U.S. interests as well as international laws and norms. And the U.S. seeks to ensure that China rises peacefully and in a way that strengthens rather than undermines the prevailing international system. The South China Sea, in my view, it's a test case, and it's seen as such by many nations inside and outside the region. So Chinese actions in the South China Sea are challenging U.S. interests in regional peace and stability in several different ways. They pose a challenge to international law. They pose a potential threat to U.S. military access and maneuverability in those waters in a crisis. They pose a test to U.S. credibility as a key provider of peace and security in the region. And for all these reasons, it is essential that a more effective multilateral strategy be developed to impose costs and to deter further destabilizing Chinese behavior, as well as provide reassurance to allies and friends in the region. The goal of such a strategy, let me say in closing, should be to persuade, again, I want to emphasize, persuade Beijing to use diplomatic means to manage its territorial disputes. Chinese officials and scholars often remind me, and others, that their country successfully resolved a number of territorial disputes around their land borders in past decades. And that is certainly true, and they did so peacefully. But people who raise this fail to mention that Beijing's principle for addressing disputes back then with their neighbors was in Chinese, hu liang hu rang, which means mutual understanding and mutual accommodation or compromise. China should be encouraged, in my view, to return to this principle in handling the disputes in the South China Sea. Thank you very much.
Bonnie, you still there?
I am.
I assume there were conversations about this when the two presidents got together. And apart from simply saying that they weren't interested in militarization, was there any kind of response to this? I mean, did they say anything about the fact that we're going to have ships floating around inside the zone? What have they said about that, if anything?
I do not know. I was obviously not in the room. But the way this was characterized to me is that on this particular issue, there was pretty much an exchange of talking points. That what Xi Jinping wrote in the Wall Street Journal interview, what he said in Seattle, was essentially what he said to the president privately, that China has long considered the land features in the South China Sea as Chinese territory, and that China is going to solve its differences peacefully. Whether President Obama actually told the Chinese that we're going to conduct these operations, I don't know. But frankly, that would be inconsistent with U.S. practice in the past. The U.S. doesn't announce or convey to countries when we conduct these operations. In fact, it's truly bizarre that ever since this was leaked to the Wall Street Journal in May, it has been such an open discussion going on that it's just inconsistent with what is usually considered to be a simple operation. It's not intended to be a military provocation of any kind. And if the Chinese, this is just my view, if the Chinese were to interfere in this operation in the way that I think it was David Sanger who said that they might send their ships or aircraft or try to push the U.S. out, that would suggest that the Chinese are actually asserting a claim of a 12 nautical mile territorial sea around a low tide elevation, which they are not entitled to under UNCLOS. So in my view, the Chinese are very smart if they don't do anything.
Strange way for two great countries to do business. Maybe I have a different view of how you're trying to discuss these things. Anyway, thank you very much. Great. Harry. Now, was he in the Philippines? Yes. He's in the Philippines. Yes. Professor, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, but I'm here in Seoul, Korea.
Oh, yes. I see. Welcome to our forum and welcome to the discussion.
My pleasure, Governor. Right. I'll keep it very, very short and sweet, given the time constraints involved. Thank you very much again, Governor, for the invitation. First of all, let me say that in the Philippines and ASEAN, I think many countries, particularly Philippines and Vietnam, I think we're glad that President Obama at least mentioned the South China Sea disputes and quite pushed back against China's reclamation activities in the area, because back in 2013, during the meeting in Sunnylands Ranch between Xi Jinping and Obama, there was not much of a discussion apparently on the South China Sea, at least in their formal statements. And I think there's a lot of excitement in the Philippines, particularly among officials, that the United States will finally pierce into the 12 nautical miles territorial sea of China's artificially created islands. I think this is very important because the position of the Philippines is that most of these were low tide elevations that are extension of the Philippines continental shelf. They cannot be appropriated, and therefore they cannot even generate their own 12 nautical miles territorial sea. So it's very important for the United States to challenge China's sovereignty claims over those artificially created features. I think there's also a lot of sense of urgency in the Philippines over the reclamation activities in the South China Sea. A while ago, Bill was talking about the fact that China has not occupied new features. But the concerns in the Philippines is that the Scarborough Shoal, which was coercively taken away from the Philippines in 2012, China may have plans of also building, facilities there with military purposes. And of course, China's airstrip construction on the Subi Reef and Mischief Reef is also of huge concern, because the Subi Reef is very close to the Tito Island, which the Philippines called Pag-asa, and the Philippines has had an airstrip there since 1973. And also China is building an airstrip in the Mischief Reef, which is very close to the Second Thomas Shoal, where the Chinese Coast Guard have placed effectively a siege on Filipino detachment in that area, and also close to the Reed Bank, which is very important to the Philippines' energy security, and the Philippines has been very desperately trying to exploit hydrocarbon resources there. So there's this huge sense of urgency in the Philippines that there should be a pushback against China's reclamation activities and its posturing in the region. To be honest, I think in the Philippines there's also a lot of frustration with the slowness of the ASEAN's ability to come up with a code of conduct. A lot of us have been proposing that at least Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia should develop a code of conduct first before foisting it upon China or trying to socialize China to sign up to that. For me personally, what is very disconcerting is that while Vietnam and China have developed at least 3 different hotlines, Japan and China have been also engaged in confidence-building measures, and as Bonnie Glasser has excellently also covered, the United States and China have also been negotiating queues and other forms of confidence-building measures. The Philippines and China have not yet negotiated any significant confidence-building measure, or there are no functional hotlines between the two countries. So as the South China Sea becomes more and more congested, the risk for accidental clashes goes higher, and the fact that the Philippines and China do not have any kind of communication channels in terms of confidence building, that is a huge concern for me. And I think what we also have to, in closing remarks, keep in mind is that these reclamation activities in China are overlapping with other clocks. For instance, in terms of the legal arbitration within a month or so, we should know if the arbitration tribunal will exercise jurisdiction on this issue. And of course, with the APEC summit in the Philippines coming soon, we hope that South China Sea issue will also be on the table, but will be discussed in a constructive manner. So I'll just keep it short and sweet, and thank you very much again for the invitation, Governor.
Thank you so much. Let me ask you a question. Why has the ASEAN process been so slow?
Right. When it comes to the political security issues, when it comes to political security issues, it's really a unanimity-based decision-making. In terms of economic affairs, I think ASEAN has done better because the decision-making process is the ASEAN minus X formula. But we do not have that in political security matters. So it takes one country, let's say Cambodia or Laos, which are very close to China, to say no, and nothing will really happen. And that's why we're saying at least there should be a code of conduct among ASEAN claimant states like Malaysia, Philippines, Brunei, and Vietnam, before we can pressure and socialize China to signing up to that. This is essentially what we did with the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation before asking US and China and other countries to sign up to that.
Well, it's great to have you with us, and I hope we can welcome you back to other discussions that we do have. But thank you so much for being a part of this.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak a little bit. I'm such an august group of China and Asia experts that I said, well, I must be able to contribute something to this conversation. And I said, well, let me take a look at it from strictly a communication, a PR point of view, which is what I do for a living. And the bottom line is China is clearly in violation of UNCLOS. It's been the law of the sea since 1994. It's been recognized by all the participants. And in terms of telling the story, I think we need to include that message in the story. We need to give our message a legal underpinning. And also in terms of awareness, one of the things that I thought was pretty interesting is Tuan asked me to speak a week or so ago, and I said, my God, what am I going to talk about? So, and I started reading news articles, and then the Democratic presidential debate came along, and how many people watched the debate? How many people saw Jim Webb saying, we're all paying all this attention to the Middle East? What about China? What about the South? What about the South China Sea? What about, and you know, that took the awareness level among the American public from here to here. But what else can we do to win the argument and to convey our side of the story? And I think about Frank Luntz, who spends his life coming up with the right words to make his point of view. And he gave us such lovely expressions as job creator and the death tax. And yeah, this is a guy who devotes his life to using the words to make the case. And so I started thinking, well, you know, how do we communicate the problems in the South China Sea? And for one thing, the press always says they're the disputed islands. They're the disputed territories. Yeah, they're Vietnamese territories. They're Vietnamese islands. If that's our argument, then call them Vietnamese islands. Give them Vietnamese names. Argentina didn't fight over the Falklands. Argentina fought over the Malvinas. And when we talk about China expanding reefs and expanding atolls that are underwater, we're almost mitigating what China is doing, which is really blocking channels of navigation. So just because blocking a channel of navigation is attached to something that's under the sea at high tide, you're basically piling rocks where ships need to go. And you know, I'll just conclude with one last point is when we talk about the runway on one of the Spratly Islands, and whether it's militarized or whether it's not. If we talk about the island and we talk about the runway, say it's long enough to land a B-52. No one knows what the Chinese counterpart is of a B-52, but everybody knows that a B-52, especially people of our age, know that a B-52 has a denotative and a connotative message that means big-time war. So underscore the message with the words that will make our point, and be harsh, be tough, but I think by doing so, we make our point, and anyway, Twan's looking at me like I should, like I've done my 2 minutes, so thank you.
Which I suspect part of the problem here is that while the United States, in this particular part of the world, talks a lot about international law, you look at U.S. conduct in the Middle East, I don't see any observance of international law at all. And you know, you've got to be consistent in this business, folks. So I imagine that when we start talking about international law, I suspect our Chinese friends scratch their heads a little bit, since they're not quite sure whether what we're talking about in Asia is what we're talking about in other parts of the world. And I think that compromises our ability to be effective under these circumstances. We'll see. Anyway, we're pleased to have Dr. Lei Wong with us. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me over, and I'll keep this really short. So last time when I was here, I talked about the importance of public opinion in this case. So, you know, the public opinion in different countries and the international public opinion in general will have a significant impact on the decision-making process in the different countries. And I also talk about that in general, the public still follow traditional news media such as newspapers and television news for information and public and viewpoints about important issues like this case. So we went ahead and conduct some analysis on the news coverage and the public opinion about the South China Sea dispute. So at the stage of the media analysis, we picked 3 countries and their respective newspapers. So we picked China, Philippines, and the United States to see how they covered the case. And then the time frame we used is from 2001, January the 1st, to December the 31st, 2014, a total of 4 years. And as for the public opinion, we look at how Twitter users talk about this case. And then from 2001, 2011 to 2014, you can see that there are a total of about 372,000 tweets that talk about the South China Sea. And you can see from this graph that South China Sea dispute triggered a lot more conversation in the year of 2014 compared with the previous years. So we just took some samples and did some preliminary analysis, and I'm going to show you some results. So we are using network analysis to see how newspapers cover the interactions between different countries. So in this graph, you can see each node represents a country, like 1 represents China, 2 represents United States, 4 represents Philippines. And in China's coverage, the triangular relationships between China, United States, and the Philippines receive the most attention. And there are quite a few articles that talk about interactions between China and Vietnam. And this graph shows you the valence of the relationship. Red represents positive, yellow represents neutral, and blue represents negative. So in China's coverage, there are equivalent amount of coverage, like positive, neutral, and a negative coverage. And actually in China's coverage, China was portrayed as a good neighbor and a country to seek peace, and a country that are willing to talk with the international community. So if you look at the interaction between China and the ASEAN, all of those links are positive. And also if we take a look at the attributes of those links, so you see those different lines, like red represents conflicts, pleas, clashes, yellow represents political dialogues, pink represents economic consequences, green refers to a frame of legal framework, black refers to public sentiment, blue refers to historical legacy. Again, as I mentioned earlier, in China's coverage, China is actively working with ASEAN to resolve the issue peacefully, even using this legal framework. And in China's coverage, China criticized the United States for intervening in the issue. And China also criticized those neighboring countries like Vietnam and the Philippines for their provocative actions to cause conflicts. So that's from the China's perspective. So because I don't have a lot of time, so I'll keep the second part short. So actually Philippines and United States, they use a similar discourse to cover this issue. And we can see that you can see that most of the links in the Philippines coverage were negative. So a majority of the news coverage in the Philippines and the United States, they highlighted the conflicts, the clashes of the issue, and then they use a lot of strong words to represent China's role. For example, Philippines use like incursions, invasions to portray China's acts, and in the United States, like the New York Times and then the Washington Post, they use words like assertive, threatening, bullying, disturbing to present China's role. And then they use words like flexed, China's flexing its muscle. And also they highlighted China's ambition to pursue the economic resources like oil resources, fishing resources in the area. And even applied that China is going to take over the world commercially. So from the standpoint of communication, you can see that I would say that the coverage, especially those Western media organizations, they sort of sensationalize the issue, and they also use a very negative tone to portray China, and that may worsen the situation. And according to our analysis, as for the side of the public, to a large extent, the Twitter conversation followed how the Western media portray the issue. And again, you can see that most of the links are negative. And then rather than talking about the diplomatic means, rather than talking about political dialogues and the conversation, the majority of the Twitter users talk about the conflicts, the rising tensions of the issue. So, so I'll just conclude to say that because of the sensationalizing of the issue of the Western news media, the public also adopt the same discourse to think about the issue, and that's not something that we want to see. So while we are talking about the solutions to resolve the issues peacefully, we also want to take the media's role into consideration. And instead of sensationalizing the issue, a more responsible, objective representation of the issue is something that we want to encourage and call for. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. We're always looking for responsible journalists, aren't we? We'll do the right thing and try to report the news accurately and well. I'm not sure we'll ever get there, but people like David continue to set that standard for us. Okay, so we've had lots of good analysis of what's going on there as best we can determine. Now let's turn to the question of how we avoid armed conflicts. And we're very fortunate to have Professor Sean Hansler with us, somebody with a military background, but also now teaching at U.S. Naval War College, and a native of Rhode Island. Welcome. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you, Governor. And I'm glad that we've got, kind of figuring out that each of the problems might be the easy part. So you gave me the, what's the solution? So 7 minutes, I think I can come up with the solution to the problem. But obviously, the speakers that have gone before me have done an outstanding job really outlining where we are now. And so what I'm going to do is really zip through some slides here, and I apologize to move beyond them to get to the slides I really want to talk about. These are the 4 questions that I want to discuss. I'm really going to linger on the last 2 there. What are China's objectives? And actions do speak louder than words, I would suggest. And I think we need to think through what China's objectives are if we're going to come up with a solution or some type of strategy to deal with that. And so I'll go to what's next. I'm going to move fairly quickly through slides that discuss the things that we've already discussed before and get to this first thing. Now, I teach at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Everything I say here is my own personal opinion. It doesn't reflect the views of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy. I know you've all heard those disclaimers. But this is where I live. This is who I teach. I teach flag officers and senior officers that go out to our numbered fleets and work what we call the operational level. So the way we view the world is we're the M of the dime fill. It's diplomatic, informational, military, economic, financial, intelligence, and legal. Those are the tools at the strategic level, the toolkit to accomplish your objectives. We reside at the operational level. We like to think that we have a phasing construct where we're trying to shape the environment here in the South China Sea so that we don't have to get to a crisis type situation. We get too deterred, and that's what we have to do. We have various theater campaign plans and security plans to try to work with regional partners, and you see us doing that across the Asia-Pacific region. Things like trying to get base access, conducting multiple exercises with many of the nations in the region, foreign military sales, at the end of the day trying to increase capability, capacity, and interoperability. With the Chinese in particular, people are not aware we've had extensive military relationships with them over the past few years, to include the exchange of our senior naval officers here recently. We've conducted port visits in each other's nations. We have a Chinese ship coming to Hawaii soon. We've negotiated agreements to eliminate the possibility of miscalculation in the air or at sea, and obviously we're going to conduct FONOPs here in the near future, at least according to the open press. So that's how we view the world. The question for the operational level of war, or operational level, is, so what's the strategy? Anything we do has to nest with the strategic strategy. I'll make a provocative argument here. I think Bonnie touched on it. I'm not so sure we have a strategy, or at least a cohesive, synchronized, integrated strategy. So, again, move forward. Actions speak louder than words. What are China's objectives? And I think our second speaker started to get to it. Here are some of the things you're seeing coming out of the press from very senior leadership in China. So these are the words that you hear. No freedom of navigation for warships and airplanes. That's a direct challenge to U.S. Vital interests. And you see down here at the bottom even more provocative statements. It's a slap in the face. We will inflict pain if we have to, and those types of statements. So where does that take us? And so here's the actions speak louder than words. We've seen timetables. I couldn't put everything up here on one slide, but at the end of the day, you can probably divide what China has been doing into 3 categories over time. Initially, when Mao took over, it's an island reclamation campaign. Sever sovereignty. Take those islands that are historically ours. And then we have an operational pause in the late 1990s and in the 2000s. Focus more on regional integration. Focus on economics. And focus on integrating your own economy with other nations' economies. Massive buildup of their military capabilities, especially their maritime capabilities, their navy, their surface missiles. So during that strategic pause, that's what they're doing. And now we see in 2007, absolutely turning back over to competition. Competition in that environment for sovereignty. Is it about resource control? Is it about enhanced security? Is it about both? I want to come back to this slide here only because it shows a picture we haven't seen before. We talk about the first island chain, the second island chain, the near seas as the Chinese referred to it. I think you can make a strong argument that what China is trying to do now is assert control over the near seas. And they've actually started to discuss, as was pointed out earlier, having a blue water navy that has the capability to assert power elsewhere, out to the second island chain, and wherever they need to. They conduct a non-combatant evacuation out in Yemen. They're talking about a base in Japan. And so they are going to do those types of things. So what I really kind of linger on, this is what I was asked to do, solve the problem here in a few minutes. But as far as the way ahead, I think my argument, and you could argue that it's provocative, I don't think the United States has a cohesive strategy to deal with China as a whole. And the United States Department of Defense just recently released, I don't know if anybody's had a chance to see it yet, the Asia-Pacific Maritime Security Strategy. So there it is in all its glory. But my question is, and it's hard to see here, is the dying bill and these lines of effort to achieve our strategic objectives, is this in alignment with the other aspects of national power? It claims in here that there was discussions between the interagency to come up with it. I'm not so sure that's the case. So where do we go from here? I come back to, before you have a strategy, what are China's objectives? And again, I'll be provocative. I'm with maybe the second speaker. I think China has every intention to assert control and sovereignty over the entire South China and East China Sea. Those bases are going to be militarized. They're going to put anti-submarine warfare, reconnaissance, strike fighter aircraft. They're going to enhance their capability to do reconnaissance, anti-submarine warfare. They're going to make it much more difficult for anybody to enjoy or assert freedom of navigation through those vital areas. I believe that that's what their intention is. So the question is, how do you deal with that? I think Bonnie brought up some good points about how you can potentially work with other nations that have similar interest in freedom of navigation in the area. But I guess what I'm really trying to suggest is we need to have a cohesive whole-of-government effort. We need to re-examine and re-look at what the assumptions are. Hope is not an option. You can't hope that people in China are going to turn around and someday, maybe be back away from things they're doing. It's a great idea, and we should work towards it and try to keep up those exchanges to the extent possible. We're going to continue to do all our military-to-military exchanges with the Chinese to try to be transparent, build trust, build relationships, but I don't think it's going to work in the near term at all. And so we need to rethink those assumptions and then come to a conclusion, what is the nature of the relationship we want with China? This is going to be a competitive environment. Get used to it. It's the new normal. So how do we deal with China in that competitive environment in a way that doesn't lead to all-out conflict? And that is really where we're at. Our national interest in freedom of navigation is now butting up against Chinese core interests. And the question then is, how are we going to deal with it? I come back to this last bullet. Other nations in the region have said, well, the United States is important and China is important. And interestingly enough, our folks at our State Department have suggested they don't intend this to be a zero-sum game. Either choose us or choose them. But and I apologize if I put my glass on here. The former foreign minister from Singapore recently said he's not sure if we have the luxury of space as we have in the past to be friendly to everyone. In the next few years, because of competition, they as major powers, as they are wont to do, will soon be talking in terms of either us or them. You're either with us or you're against us. Hopefully it doesn't come down to that, but that is absolutely where certain people think we're going to be. South Koreans are here now to have these discussions. We just talked to the Australians. The Chinese president, U.S. president, will be in Vietnam in November. So we'll see how this plays out. But we come back to, what are these objectives in this guessing game we're playing with respect to ambiguity, how they react to these spot-offs, how they react to this court case about jurisdiction, and how they deal with the folks in Vietnam, I think are going to tell the tale. And at the end of the day, I think people are fooling themselves if they don't think this is going to be a very competitive environment in the near and midterm. It's going to be the problem we're going to have to deal with. So maybe Governor Webb had it right the other night. I don't know. But anyway, that's hopefully provocative. That's not what I necessarily came to say, but that's what I said. So thank you, Governor.
Thanks, Justin. So I suppose one of the questions is competitive about what and for what? But it's not a ball game. Interesting. Okay, we don't have an awful lot of time. We've got 4 or 5 speakers that we want to hear from before we wrap up. So I'm going to ask Elliot Salway, who's been one of our regulars, to come up and talk for just a few minutes. And Tom Patterson, who's one of the founders of this forum. We'll then go to Brent Colburn, to Grand Road, and finally to my colleague, Susanna. And we're going to wrap up. So, Elliot, a few quick minutes.
Okay. My job at Boston Global Forum is in terms of increasing awareness through art to the community at large and to the world at large on the problems that Boston Global Forum chooses to look for solutions. The first one is one we're dealing with now, the South China Sea. When you see this video, it's going to be 3 minutes. I want you to keep in mind the quote that we have caveman minds and at the same time science fiction weapons. And when we look at these videos,
on the reefs where the water level
on the reefs where the water level covered half their bodies. The Vietnamese sailors set up commanding positions along the edge of the reefs to lay the defending lines and tried to prevent the enemy from advancing forward. They were threatened by the Chinese to retreat from the reefs. This intrusion caused strong reaction from the Vietnamese defenders to hold their flag. They determined to hold on to the reef and keep their flag flying at any cost. Just because the Vietnamese Navy had refused to withdraw from the reef, the Chinese used battleship for firing with 37mm anti-aircraft guns directly at the unarmed and light-armed Vietnamese sailors on the reefs, who were not able to attack them for their defending positions. They also fired fiercely with 100mm gun at the 3 Vietnamese transport ships. 2 of them sank.
Aircraft. This is Chinese Navy. You are approaching our military alert zone. Leave immediately.
High above the South China Sea, the radio crackles with a stern warning.
Go, go!
The source of dispute appears on the horizon seemingly out of nowhere. Islands, man-made by China, hundreds of miles from its coastline. In just 2 years, China has expanded these islands by 2,000 acres, the equivalent of 1,500 football fields and counting, an engineering marvel in waters as deep as 300 feet. What used to be the Fiery Cross Reef now has early warning radar, an airport tower, and a runway long enough to handle every aircraft in the Chinese military. Some are calling it China's unsinkable aircraft carrier. These videos of the islands, taken from the P-8's advanced surveillance cameras, never before declassified.
I apologize, we don't have the PowerPoint, but I'll take 2 minutes to let you know and tell you. In Eastern Europe, I'm working with a Project Exodus, which I co-founded, where we work with children, painting and creating images that have to do with genocide and the causes of genocide and crimes against humanity. I'm taking that same framework to Boston Global Forum. I am going to China and talking with the art community about doing the same thing. The idea is to have young people, not only teenagers, but if we go down to even 8-year-olds, we can increase empathy, we can increase perhaps in the future and prevention of these kinds of things. Again, I apologize not having the images, but thank you very much.
So in a previous conference, we issued a white paper, Framework for Peace and Security in the Pacific. It's posted on our website. For this conference, we prepared a follow-up report that focuses entirely on China's actions in the South China Sea. Again, it's on our website, and I'll just briefly say what it contains. It contains a detailed documentation of China's aggressive actions in the South China Sea. Explains, as best we could, China's lack of transparency about its intentions, and in detail discusses China's rejection of the use of international law to govern these disputes, and its insistence on bilateral solution, which would put the former nations at a disadvantage in such negotiations. And we conclude the report with a set of possible responses to China's actions. One, finding ways to strengthen international law, and particularly the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, fostering economic integration in the region on the assumption that interdependency will reduce the likelihood of armed conflict, developing a code of conduct along the lines that was discussed earlier in this session. And finally, we ask, but really don't answer the question of whether a strategic alliance is needed in the region. It would be an alliance where the member nations would stand together in the face of aggressive action devoted or directed at any one of them, minimally including the US, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Australia, and would be formed with a standing invitation of membership to China should it agree to the alliance's norms and standards. Again, that's a quick summary. It's on our website, and I invite you to take it up. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you for the forum. Thank you, Governor, for having me. And I also want to give my best to the senior Chinese intel official who's probably listening to us right now. Hope they've enjoyed all of the presentations. I was given a very similar assignment as the professor. In 3 minutes, talk about how we avoid armed conflict in the South China Sea. I'm at the Kennedy School right now as a fellow, but before that, I was the head of public affairs at the Pentagon under both Secretary Hagel and the first 6 months of Secretary Carter's tenure. As you all know, the number one qualification a public affairs person has is that you get to sit in a lot of meetings with a lot of smart people. These conclusions are based on those wonderful experiences. I'll keep it very, very short. There's 2 things we have to keep in mind. Bonnie hit on one of these earlier. First of all, you have to remember this is crucial for U.S. economic interest. Those of you that have been to the Straits of Malacca and seen this flow and transit of goods understand that what we're talking about is a strategic situation with economic impacts. And so that's something that matters to people here at home in a way they may not realize, but is very real if we get this wrong. And second, we just need to remember that when it comes to China, we're playing the long game, right? This is the 30, 40-year problem. And that has to influence our thinking. So a lot of what we've talked about today is how do we deal with this right now, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about is how do we deal with China writ large. But this is a symptom of the types of problems that we're going to have. 4 quick things, 3 that will resonate as things we've talked about today. 1, a little bit outside the box. The first thing we need to do is make sure we have clear lines of communication. That's at every single level. Professor talked about a lot of those. Tactically, we need to be making sure we have codes of conduct for the intersection of ships and planes. We don't have accidents and unintended incidents. That's happening. We're working on that. I think we're making some progress. If we stick to them is another thing, but we're starting to put them in place. Second, moving up the tree a little bit, mill-to-mill relations. I think we've made progress under that. It was a real area of focus for both Secretary Panetta and Secretary Hagel. And again, that's very important over the long run because that mill-to-mill, especially the uniform-to-uniform relationships, can become a safety valve and also a conduit for trusted diplomacy when traditional diplomacy is being gummed up by public discourse and some of the rhetoric that political figures in both countries may be using. And then finally, we're going to have this conversation in public at a political level. And I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that we do that in a way that shines a light on what China is doing. We saw Jim Sciutto's piece about his P-8 flight that garnered quite a bit of attention. I think the most interesting thing to remember about that is that was a regular P-8 flight that we flew every single day. And the Chinese only got angry once it became public that we were doing that. And we were not public about the fact we were doing it. It's just that footage was on TV every day. So that public discourse and transparency from our side, even if they aren't transparent, is important. Number two, long-term military spending and planning. We have wolves closer to the door right now in terms of the Middle East and what's going on with Putin, but we can't lose sight of the requirements that we have to make sure we are investing in this part of the world. A lot of what the president's talked about with the rebalance. We have to stick to that. That includes making sure that we are addressing not just these examples of a Chinese military that is looking outward more and more. That includes the Navy and their investment in aircraft carriers. That includes increased UN participation in peacekeeping by the Chinese. They're showing they're going to push out, and we need to make sure that we have the capabilities in 20, 30, 40 years to deal with that. That means making investments now. And on a side, quick editorial note, during the debate last week, all of the candidates got my least favorite debate question, which is, what is the #1 geopolitical threat to the United States right now? If I did have to give a one answer, it's sequestration. It's the thing that puts not just this strategy or our attempts to develop a strategy in this area at risk, it puts all of our security at risk. So if we don't do something about sequestration, China and other problems around the world are just going to get harder. And then the third thing that we've talked about consistently is increasing partnerships in the region. So we need to take advantage of the fact that Chinese actions are driving people in our direction. We saw this last spring at the Shangri-La Security Dialogue, which happened right after that CNN report and right after pictures were released showing howitzers on some of these islands. There was a very different tone with a lot of our partners, both traditional and non-traditional partners in the region. So Australia, Japan, South Korea, but also Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines. The fourth one, and then I'll wrap up, is we need to figure out cyber, because we always assume the ignition point for a conflict with China is going to be in the South China Sea. The ignition point can be in the cyber realm, and then the escalation can be in the South China Sea, a place where we are about to have a lot of ships and planes flying around in very close contact. So we need to look at the entire China problem, especially the wild west of the China problem, which is the cyberspace. Get our arms around that quickly, so this doesn't become where bad gets worse, not just where bad starts. So, wow, was that pretty good? Yes. 3 minutes? Okay, great. Thanks, guys. Thank you all.
Thanks very much, Governor, and Tuan. There have been many interesting and useful comments here today. I think Sean's talking about the need for some kind of comprehensive national strategy for China, extremely important. A couple of different ways of looking at that are hard power, soft power, smart power. And we have to think about the soft power aspects on the dime. We talked about the military side. I'm going to bring two small suggestions that are on the DI and E side. The first one is that in the last paragraph of Bill Hayden's book, he talks about the need to de-escalate the South China Sea, that Taiwan can play a very important role, because they actually developed the map in 1947 on which the line was based. I spent a very interesting hour with a Taiwan scholar, an international legal scholar, this summer, looking at that map. And if you look at it, there's a line in the upper left-hand corner, which is the land border of Vietnam and China. And then the same type of line comes into the South China Sea, but it's separated by dashes. His interpretation of that is this is not a settled boundary. This is subject to negotiation between the parties. This is not the story that we hear from China about this, but it kind of takes the wind out of the sail for China. If in fact this is an informational point, this is an eye out of the dime. That one point that we could pursue. It might be worth inviting some of these Taiwan scholars to talk to us in more detail. The second point that I wanted to bring up is. And I'm sorry the Japanese consul had to leave early because they played a very important part in this. And that is that, if you remember, on September 25th and 26th of 2012, after the so-called nationalization of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, that the fleet from Suao Harbor in Taiwan came up and was repulsed from the islands by the Japanese Coast Guard in what looked like a fog of war photos at the time. Very dangerous. There could have been encounters. It could have been collision. It could have been a ship sinking. And but somehow President Ma Ying-jeou of Taiwan and Prime Minister Abe of Japan had a statesmanship moment where they decided that they would break the impasse in negotiations of 16 years of negotiations that had failed to come to a fishing agreement between Taiwan and Japan. And that spring, in April, they actually concluded that fishing agreement. So I went to ask questions about, how did this happen? How is it actually being implemented? Is it a success? Is it not? So, report agreement, a couple of pages, 5 articles, but good description of an area 3 times the size of Taiwan that is now a joint fishing area between the parties. The big areas of discussion between them are in the southern part where there's a triangle that's almost right over the Okinawa Trench, and on the east side where there's a quadrilateral. So there are zones in here where there's the most conflict between fishing boats between Taiwan and Japan. And so the fishing committee that was set up in Article 3 of the agreement meets at least once a year, and they have managed to sort out the hard problems of whether the fish is west or north-south. The nets are 40 kilometers long, 25 miles long. They cross. The Taiwan nets are much heavier. The Japanese equipment is destroyed. This big problem. But the committee has been able to work this out. They're working hard. There are 2 small triangle areas that are not settled yet, but they're still on the negotiating table. So I just wanted to bring this up as an example of something out of the diplomacy and economic side that Taiwan is now involved in negotiating fishing agreement with the Philippines, moving to the South China Sea. And so that this is a model that could go on with Vietnam, but we would perhaps hold examples as food for thought.
So there is hope for a little constructive dialogue. Professor Iger.
Thank you. I first wanted to just say something about the comment that the political candidates were paying so much attention to the Middle East and not to China and the South China Sea. I think this is explainable in part because the islands are pieces of rocks and territory that don't involve a large number of people. There haven't been a large number of deaths involved in these conflicts. Whereas in the Middle East, we have a constant military presence by the United States, and a lot of people have died, and there are literally millions of migrants. So I think that's one of the reasons that it doesn't rise to the forefront of Americans thinking about China. When the average American thinks about China, they're often thinking about trade, trade competition, loss of jobs, or something like that. They're not thinking about the South China Sea. I've been asked to talk about the Boston Global Forum's framework for peace and security that is posted on the website. I think it's an excellent document on its 4 major points, which is respect for international law, mutual respect among affected countries, regional interdependence and multilateralism, plus ideas of economic development, a code of conduct, and more confidence-building measures in the area. But I have some problems with it when it comes to the statement that the United States military presence in Asia needs to be expanded, and of course that's what everybody is talking about today. So I'm the last speaker. I should have been one of the first, and everybody could have railed against me. I want to just conclude by looking at trying to understand China from the perspective of if you're sitting in Beijing rather than in London or New York or Washington, the world looks quite different. East Asia looks quite different. China is about the same size as the United States, but unlike ourselves, it has close to 20 countries on its borders. And it is also a country that is fully aware of what the United States has done in the world, how it sometimes uses human rights policies to justify intervention, and it's also aware of our policies, our NATO policies of expansion, after promising that we would not continue to expand NATO to Russian borders. We have, in fact, done that and tried to do more of it. Furthermore, the Trans-Pacific Pact feels, if you're in Beijing, a lot like part of a new containment policy for China. And China is also aware that the United States has ignored other kinds of developments in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, but it treats China's actions doing the same thing, it comes down hard on them. So in the South China Sea, after 2002, when China honored the Code of Conduct Agreement permitting only joint drilling in disputed waters, ASEAN countries drilled hundreds of wells in disputed waters, and the United States said nothing. But when China did it, we spoke out, as Bill Overholt has pointed out in great detail. China has a foreign policy that has underlying principles, but China is also changing some of its attitudes and is also responding to some of the pushback by the Japanese and the United States and others in East Asia. And so I think if we look at China today, we have to look at a country that is also looking at alternatives. It's not just looking at the South China Sea. It's also very in the Silk Road, in the One Belt, One Road concept. It's building think tanks that is hoping to promote its own values worldwide. Its press and its television is dedicated to this. For those of you who get the Boston Globe, while Xi Jinping was here, we were treated to the China Daily, tucked into the Boston Globe every day that he was in the country. And we get it every week on a weekly basis anyway. So China's trying to promote its own values. It doesn't have to be necessarily hostile. Let me just conclude by building on what Elizabeth Economy has said about some of the things that we need to do to make a more peaceful world in East Asia. First, the United States needs to give China a chance to lead in the world, to forge policies and present them on their own initiative on things like climate change, even Afghanistan and many other things. Get them involved, have them participate with us in these policies. Secondly, don't create a problem when there is none. China's new infrastructure and investment bank could be extremely valuable for all of us. It could be valuable for East Asia. There's no reason to make a big fuss about this. And we should not give the Chinese any fodder for ideas about building further air identification zones by the things that we do. And finally, not everything needs to be framed as a competition between China and the United States. We're part of a very complicated world, and there's a lot more going on than just what's going on between China and the United States. So we need a framework that involves not just China and the United States, and neglects other countries who are very important to all of us in this world and what they do. Thank you.
Do this in 1 minute. I will be a great celebrity and very popular. I'm a private pilot. I don't fly these days, but I spent many years flying airplanes. And there's one thing that's a truth, that if you see an object in the sky and it is getting larger but remains stationary, you are on a collision course. My wife, who was sitting over there, we were flying up in Maryland once, and she said, "Didn't you say to me things get bigger on the horizon?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, those airplanes are getting much bigger." The answer to that is you brake. Ideally, both parties brake. Both aircraft brake. There's no collision. If one aircraft brakes, you may get away with it. It seems to me that China is the stationary aircraft getting closer, and we get more and more upset, more agitated about it, without really having a plan where both can break, where both can get away from a controversy that has no solution. At the present time, there is no real solution in the South China Sea. We need a different accommodation with China so that that can be part of something else rather than the center of power. This has happened over time. I think that part of what we can do is to seek a larger negotiation with China. We also should seek many other goals with China, but not to concentrate exclusively on the current situation in the South China Sea, to get around it so that we give something else to China, or we do a deal with China of greater interest to China than expanding the islands in the South China Sea. We need to continue, in my opinion, to sign as many treaties as possible. Nations actually mostly abide by their treaties. Sometimes they violate them. I think we need an accommodation with China, and I think it's a very difficult situation to come to any sort of accommodation because of an asymmetry that exists in information. I'm glad it was mentioned. I spent a lot of time working on situations in South Africa. One of the problems there was not that the press was controlled by the government, but certainly there were not enough ideas. There were more ideas about the future of South Africa in Cape Town, in London and Washington than there were in Cape Town and Pretoria. This is a situation exacerbated. We have state control of the media. China has been accelerating nationalism. It has been stirring up its people with a single point of view. This is very bad. The last point I would make is that it is absolutely excellent that we communicate with the Chinese on every level. And joint military exchanges are very valuable. I spent a lot of time in the nuclear weapons arena, and one of the truths there was that right through the Cold War, we shared information about weapons with the Russians. We shared insensitive explosives for detonation. We shared better fail-safe switching. Many levels of cooperation between great nations are necessary, and new accommodations and new ideas to get us over and past old sticking points. And I do agree that South China Sea is one enormous and potentially dangerous sticking point.
Well, I've been asked to comment on U.S.-China relations in the aftermath of the summit between Xi Jinping and Barack Obama. Before going into the summit, there were two major issues of contention that were harming the U.S.-China relations. One was the issue of cyber espionage, particularly the theft of intellectual property, and the other was the issue of the South China Sea and the questions of freedom of navigation and access to the sea. I think you could argue that at the summit there was a surprising degree of progress made on the first issue, but not much progress made on the second issue. At the same time, there was another issue which was not a contentious issue, but an important issue, and that was the issue of climate and climate change. And there, the fact that the U.S. and China have brought their positions closer together after the Obama visit to Beijing a year ago, I think is a helpful sign in terms of having a presentation in the Paris climate conference in December this year. The U.S. and Chinese positions won't be so far apart. This is progress when you look back to 2009 in Copenhagen, where U.S. and China were quite some distance apart. It's not enough on the part of either country, but it is progress from where things were a few years ago. On the issue of cyber, what's interesting is that there has been significant progress, and it does come as the result of the summit. when Xi Jinping and Obama met at the summit in Sunnylands in California in 2013, they raised the issue of cyber, and they agreed to set up a joint commission at the bureaucratic level to study it. But then two things happened. One is the revelations by Edward Snowden about American intrusions into Chinese systems, among others. And the other was the American indictment of 5 PLA officers for their role in stealing intellectual property. And these indictments led the Chinese government then to curtail or to suspend their participation in the Joint Commission. On the other hand, it may be that the indictments had some effect, because it was not likely these officers would ever stand trial in an American court, but it did have effect of signaling to the Chinese that we took this issue seriously, and in addition to basically have a naming and shaming effect. In addition to that, the United States had talked about adding additional sanctions, and there had been leaking in Washington saying that there might be more sanctions over the issue of espionage for commercial competitive purposes. What was interesting is that at the summit, Xi Jinping agreed with Obama that both countries would forego intruding in each other's networks to steal intellectual property and share it with companies for commercial advantage. They also agreed to set up a joint commission or engage in joint procedures for investigation of crises in the cyber area if they occurred. That remains to be seen how it will be implemented, but it is a considerable change from the positions that the two countries had a year or more ago. So in that sense, China moved its declaratory policy quite considerably. The big question is, will it also change its behavior? The other thing they agreed to in cyber was to look at developing rules of the road for confidence building and setting norms for cyber warfare. And there they agreed to pick up a proposal by the UN group of government experts, 20 countries, experts that have been meeting at the UN, submitted a report last July. And one of the things that report proposed was to have an agreement on not attacking certain types of civilian facilities during peacetime. In addition to that, they created their own expert group to look at how you could develop that and implement the idea. And they set up a hotline for discussion in the case of cyber crises. So on the issue of cyber, you could argue that the things were quite different after the summit than they were before the summit. Contrast that with the South China Sea issue, and you'll see that much less progress was made there. The United States has insisted that while we do not take a position on the sovereignty of the various land features in the South China Sea, we do insist that there be freedom of navigation under the law of the sea treaty for the South China Sea, and therefore we cannot accept the so-called 9-dash line, where China treats the whole of the South China Sea as though it were a Chinese lake. The other point that's worth noticing there is that even when China doesn't claim everything within the South China Sea's 9-dash line, they have been expanding a number of rocky features and shoals by sand reclamation, and claiming there are about 5 of these that they claim that are going to be for peaceful purposes only. But the interesting question is whether they will think that these features that they've expanded have a right to a territorial sea. Under the Law of the Sea Treaty, they don't. The Law of the Sea Treaty basically does not allow you to pour sand on a rock and call it an island which has a territorial sea. So the United States has been complaining about this. I don't think, from what was publicly reported, there was much progress between Obama and Xi Jinping on this. And now, more recently, Secretary of Defense Carter has reiterated the view that the United States feels free to navigate any place that's permitted under international law, and that includes within 12 miles of these various features that the Chinese have enhanced with sand reclamation. I hope that this will be a procedure that is accepted by both sides. For example, Americans are now talking about either sailing or flying within the 12 miles of these features in what's called innocent passage. The Chinese, when they had ships off the coast of Alaska, went within 12 miles of one of the Aleutian Islands, and that was quite acceptable under international law as innocent passage. So we'll see whether if the United States does sail close to these features, it becomes something which is regarded as reassertion of rights under freedom of navigation, and does not lead to larger disputes between the countries. I think in that sense, in both these issues, cyber and freedom of navigation of the South China Sea, we'll have to see in the months ahead whether behavior follows the declaratory policy. In the case of cyber, whether there really is a change in the Chinese theft of intellectual property for commercial purposes, and on the South China Sea, whether the agreement that we live under the Law of the Sea Treaty will be accepted. The Chinese have not formally accepted the jurisdiction of the tribunal in the case that's brought by the Philippines. We'll have to see what comes out on that. But I think the U.S. is correct to anchor its position in the Law of the Sea Treaty. So that's, I think, where Chinese and American relations stand after the summit. Some progress, some area of ambiguity, and we'll have to wait on events to see how those play out. Thank you very much.
Good morning から言ったらいいんですかね。This is Vice Admiral Fumi Oda, retired Maritime Self-Defense Force. Chinese reclamation in the South China Sea has been developing significantly. Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs Wang Yi stated at the Southeast Asian Summit Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia in August that it had halted land reclamation effort. This is, however, a deception which Sun Tzu stated in the first chapter of his Art of War. China does not want a direct confrontation with the United States, but want to expand her sphere of influence. Therefore, China has been and will be making incremental approach, so-called salami slicing strategy. Not only Xi Jinping's statement at the 70th anniversary Victory of Japan Day, but also the latest Chinese defense white paper stated that China will never seek hegemony or expansion, but this is another deception. In order to cope against Chinese strategy, we have to avoid a competition neither China versus United States nor China versus Japan. At the last Boston Global Forum on April 20, I made two proposals. I'd like to restate those. The first, all maritime nations should bind together and create a strong hedge in order to counter Chinese maritime aggression. We have to make a competition China against the world as a whole or international community. Therefore, not only the United States and Japan, but also other states such as Australia, India, Vietnam, and Philippines should make a collective naval vessel passage within 12 nautical miles from Chinese artificial islands in the South China Sea. I'm expecting the U.S. leadership on this matter. If we do not demonstrate our freedom of navigation right, Chinese artificial island and adjacent waters become de facto Chinese territory by international customary law, and China will establish her air defense identification zone in the South China Sea near future. China wants to create de facto territory before Obama administration will be terminated. My second proposal was that we have to conduct an offset strategy which demonstrates transparency and counters China's disinformation campaign. We should disclose to the international community by social media the truth of what China has been actually doing. This is very effective because China always wants to save her face in the nature of her behavior and therefore make correct what China is doing according to what has been disclosed. What Chinese leaders mentioned, such as halted reclamation and never seek hegemony or expansion, were completely false. We have to keep effort to bring what China is actually doing to light. We should not trust what Chinese leaders said and what China is really doing. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Mitoji Abunaka, the former Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan, and now currently I'm teaching at the university, what's called Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto. Now I'm very happy to join the discussion, the conversation. Unfortunately, I can't be on time, but I'd like to speak a little bit about how I see about South China Sea and East China Sea. When I was learned that the United States is going to send the ships within the 12 miles of the islands that China is drilling and reclamations underway, I thought it's a good idea. The reason why is, of course, when China a few years ago announced its air defense identification zones, United States sent flew B-52 immediately without notifying China. And then, as a matter of fact, it nullified the announcement of China. But this time, the idea came that the US might send a ship within 12 miles zones, and yet when China reacted very sharply, opposing that, then US deserted or somehow not quite sure what the US is going to do. That's not really a very, very good idea for US to do so. Once you have idea to do so, and then you have to be very fair. But of course, I know that you can't have confrontation with China. Of course not. And Japan as well. Certainly that we should explore ways how to live peacefully and harmoniously with China. And we have a pretty good idea about that with regard to East China Sea. And of course, South China Sea and north of that East China Sea. If I may first tell a bit about what happened in East China Sea in 2008. Well, 7 years ago, you're talking about old stories, and yet this is very, very new, even today. And the agreement is, as you might see in that map that I'll show you, the map is about Japan-China Joint Exploration Agreement. And yes, indeed, in 2008, we agreed to do the joint exploration of natural gas in the seabed. We talk about, yes, let's make the East China Sea a sea of peace, cooperation, and friendship. And as a first step, we agreed, let's say, find out the area, which is very, very small, the circled the area, what it is called Japan-China Joint Exploration Site. And key point here is that China used to say, yes, because of a continental shelf extension, their waters go as far as Okinawa Trough, meaning that entire East China Sea is actually the China water. We say it's no way. The UN Sea of Law, the treaty, says that when there are two countries, you must negotiate and find a kind of a mutually agreed sort of demarcations. And normally we say it is medium line, so separated into half the waters. What actually happened in 2008 is, of course, it is only the first step. And yet that sort of the agreed upon area for joint explorations, and key point here is the medium line is running through that, the agreed zones. And they say, Mr. Yamanaka, the Shirakawa, south of that, that's of course the west of medium line. So it's nothing to do with Japan, they said. So we said, well, under the waters, when you drill some gas from Chinese side, ours might be pumped away. It's kind of straw, the effect, we said. So in the end we agreed, yes, in accordance with Chinese law, they are going to develop it, and yet Japanese companies are going to join it. More recently, unfortunately, this hasn't come yet as the treaty. They say it's too sensitive. Yes, that's okay. They say it is too sensitive, and yet it's, we say we have reconfirmed once again and again between two summit tiers between Japan and China. Yes, this is an agreement. Well, some years has passed. In most recently, the Japanese side posted a kind of the photos taken by Japanese self-defense forces that shows a lot of sort of pipeline and a lot of the explorations are to be begun in the west of the medium line, and that platform's pictures came out. And they said, well, this is nothing to do with agreement. Agreement, yes, we have it, is very important. So, as a matter of fact, they reaffirmed this is an agreement. And as a first step, I think that we have to say, keep saying, we should make it a kind of actual translations of that agreement into the reality. Now, my kind of idea today is for Abe to announce three things on these matters. Number one is, yes, we have to have a kind of the emergency prepared mechanisms. That there's no accidental sort of actions taken by either side. So this is rather immediate one. And long term, we should have a joint sort of rules that covers both East China Sea and South China Sea. And for those kind of maritime rules for peace is a kind of idea. And third things is, as a first step with regard to this, is China Sea translated into actual sort of agreement. And let's explore jointly. And that will certainly tell the world, yes, Japan and China is cooperating. Now, key point here, as I said, is that confrontation, no way. That also certainly covers South China Sea. Today, of course, the China says entire South China Sea is in their waters. Certainly Vietnam opposes that, Philippines oppose that. And I hope that there is a kind of spirit of cooperation between Japan, China, and ASEAN countries. We should explore the ways, and we should press China. Let's work for the peace. You say peace, China, and we say peace, of course, and find out the kind of common rules. This is what I hope, really, that Abe will do all kind of smart leadership to convince China, and of course, audiences is US, India, all over the world. That's my idea. I hope it is not just a dream, but it will be realized. Thank you very much.
Situation in South China Sea also a source of serious concern for Japan and other Asian countries, because Japan and many other Asian countries are heavily relying on Middle East as a source of energy. And for example, most of oil which Japan imports from Middle East comes through South China Sea. So if there is some crisis in South China Sea, Japan and other Asian countries may have to find alternative sea lane to deliver energy from Middle East to their countries. And according to some Japanese think tank estimate, shipping cost from Middle East to Japan will go up by 200 and 300 billion Japanese yen per year, because Japan have to find deliver a ship, shipping cost, because a sea lane will get longer in case Japan cannot use South China Sea. But the impact of the South China Sea crisis is not only limited to an economic domain, but moreover, security implication is more important. If world community cannot do anything to prevent China from changing status quo unilaterally, this may cause, U.S. allies and partners in Asian country may start to wonder to how much extent that they can rely on U.S. leadership to maintain the stability in this region. Also, China may think that they can do the same, not only in South China Sea, but also in East China Sea, including Senkaku Island. So if we cannot do anything to stop them, this situation might get even worse in the near future. So question is what we can do and what we should do. Of course, in order to avoid unnecessary conflict, both parties should restrain themselves from adopting provocative actions. So China have to be less assertive and stop what they are doing right now. On the other hand, other disputed countries like Vietnam and Philippines also should avoid to adopt assertive or provocative actions. But what is going on right now is that it is China which is now changing status quo very drastically by unilateral action. So question is, after all, what we can do to deter China's assertive action. In this sense, I think that, after all, it's a balance of power. We have to fix the changing balance of power due to the Chinese military build-up to be more appropriate balance. In this sense, I hope that U.S. shows leadership by taking visible action to deter China's action. Concretely speaking, as U.S. media, as reported by several U.S. media, I watch, and other Asian countries, I think, watch very carefully whether Obama administration will send military asset within the 12 nautical miles of artificial island which China is building. By doing it, U.S. and other allies and partner countries should send a strong signal that we cannot regard those artificial islands as a territory of China, legitimate territory of China. Sending that kind of message is very important. Thank you.
Had a very lively discussion, folks. Thanks to all of you, both here and around the world. I happen to be an optimist about these kinds of things. China's a young, obviously aggressive, at the same time interesting place. They're finding that the world economy doesn't always behave the way one would like it to. They're gonna have their issues as they move forward. But I don't think there's anything about this relationship that can't be resolved by continuing dialogue, by trying to create the kind of framework that this forum has proposed. And as a guy who's now a few weeks away from his 82nd birthday, it's a better world today, folks, than it was back in my youth. And we just got to keep working to make it better. Anyway, thank you all very, very much.